So we now begin our discussion of the quote-unquote modern period of the Middle East, which I think early on I indicated from the perspective of most historians begins with the French occupation of Egypt under Napoleon. And that might surprise some people, right? So, the basic idea is that something fundamentally is going to change from this point forward. There's going to be a kind of different awareness of Europe, and kind of very rapidly growing concern about, the growing influence of Europe, the possibility of being dominated by Europe, initially kind of more economically and culturally, but then eventually in a more direct way, politically. And so something is going to change from this point forward. But let's start with the beginning of the story. So most of you have heard of Napoleon, right? At this point, he is a general of the French Revolutionary Army in Italy. So he hasn't yet seized power. And at some point, and by the way, a lot of historians, they debate exactly the reason for this, but at some point he proposed to the French government an expedition to Egypt. And a lot of them were like, well, that just came out of nowhere. So historians still debate exactly what was the ambition of Napoleon. This is really before European colonialism gets underway, so it doesn't really make sense to talk about this as, kind of like a first step towards building up a colonial empire throughout the non-European world. Some historians feel that this might reflect more kind of, individual goals, and Napoleon saw himself as a kind of, the second coming of Alexander the Great, so wanted to create pretty much an empire in exactly the same place that Alexander the Great had it. In any event, he was also becoming a very popular figure back home, and many in the government saw him as a threat, so they were like, great, if we can get him out of Europe, why not? And so they agreed. And so eventually, the expedition landed on the coast on July 1st, 1798, very quickly took control of Alexandria, had a major battle with the regional governors at that time, the Mamluks, who at this point are governing on behalf of Ottoman authority. But in many ways, Egypt had become somewhat autonomous by this point. But in any event, the first battle is pretty much a rout. I mean, the Mamluks are handily defeated. And kind of telling in this regard is only 300 French soldiers are killed versus 6,000 Egyptians. So very quickly, Napoleon and the French have taken control of Egypt. So the first thing Napoleon does after arriving is to issue proclamations in Arabic, explaining to the Egyptians how he and the French have tremendous respect, tremendous reverence for Muhammad and the Quran, that they're there to spread French revolutionary values, that all men are equal except by virtue of their own intellectual and moral excellences, to liberate them from the oppression of Mamluk government. And finally, that the French are sincere Muslims. Indeed, they had only recently overthrown papal authority in Rome. And that last point is true. That had more to do with kind of French revolutionary attitudes about the church, kind of anti-religion, particularly anti-Catholic church. But in any event, for many Egyptians, they're like, being anti-Catholic is not the same thing as being Muslim, and we don't really have a problem with the Catholic Church. So they're a little skeptical. And in fact, Napoleon claims that, he is there representing Ottoman authority, news to the Ottoman Empire, and every time they raise the French flag, they raise the Ottoman flag as well. At some point, the local religious authorities, the ulama, send a delegation from Azhar Mosque, probably even today, maybe the most prestigious center of Islamic learning. So they send a delegation to Napoleon. They're like, okay, we get, you have to make all this kind of propaganda. Come on, it's just us now. Why are you really here? To which Napoleon repeats the same proclamation. They're like, okay, fine, let's see how this plays. I think the best way of putting it is they adopt a wait-and-see attitude. Maybe something good comes from this. We weren't crazy about Mamluk rule. At some point, the French set up a municipal council in Cairo. With quote-unquote elected, somewhat selected delegates from throughout Egypt. Maybe some form of self-government, kind of French revolutionary values, government for the people, of the people, yada, yada, yada. It very quickly becomes apparent that the purpose of the municipal council is to simply rubber stamp French decrees, i.e. just to give their seal of approval to decrees being issued from the top down. So before too long, many Egyptians becoming a little bit cynical about the purposes of the French. Though in any event, the French aren't going anywhere. Shortly after occupying Egypt, the British send a fleet under a fellow named Horatio Nelson, will become very famous during the Napoleonic Wars, and they destroy the French fleet in the Bay of Abukir, just off the coast near Alexandria. So the French are pretty much landlocked from this point forward. In the meantime, the longer they're there, the more, or shall we say, the less welcome they become. And, it's one thing to gain control of a territory. It's another thing to consolidate your control of it. And, yes, they had defeated the Mamluk armies, but they didn't exactly eliminate them. So they're kind of still at large. The former Mamluk governor is out there with the army, with the Mamluk army, somewhere in the desert. And, really becomes difficult for the French anytime they move away from a major population center, right? They're continuously being harassed by the Mamluks. Meanwhile, French administration is going to prove very unpopular, particularly a series of reforms that the French implement that are seen as being very un-Islamic. And I want to be very careful about how we use that term. We don't mean that in some way they were incompatible with Sharia or Islamic law, but rather in a kind of, more general, vague sense, they were perceived as being very foreign. The way Americans might talk about something as being un-American. There is no kind of precise definition of what constitutes something as being American, right? And most Egyptians not especially well educated about the particulars of their faith. Simply, the things that are familiar, that seem compatible with their way of life are seen as Islamic, and much of what the French are introducing is seen as being quite the opposite. The thing that finally proves to be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back is the imposition of a house tax. I'm not even sure, is that really about, being un-Islamic, being foreign, or simply the fact that there is one additional tax that you have to pay money for? And that leads to an insurrection in October, beginning on the 22nd. The insurrection will be somewhat headed by at least some members of the ulama. Headquarters ends up being Azhar Mosque, which is even today the preeminent center, or one of them, of Islamic learning. Certainly a very important institution at that time. And this isn't going to prove to be something that, from a strictly military point of view, that the French can't handle. They're very easily able to suppress the rebellion. But pretty much from that point forward, there's no question about the French and Egyptians getting along, or Egyptians accepting the French presence. And from that point on, there's going to be a growing resistance, which we probably should characterize as being religious. Again, being a bit careful using that term. Again, more the idea that the French are seen as, this very foreign, kind of entity, very disrespectful of their traditional way of life and so forth. Certainly, we can't characterize the resistance as being nationalistic. The nationalism as a kind of ideological way of defining one's communal identity, a very new phenomenon at this point. We're going to be getting into that a bit down the road, so I don't want to get into it in great detail right now. But let's just say most Egyptians do not identify themselves as such. And in fact, in most parts of the world, you really wouldn't find this kind of way of identifying, the larger group to which one belonged. So again, French increasingly being very unwelcome, perceived as disrespectful to the Egyptian way of life. We should note that the feeling is somewhat mutual. The French are increasingly, kind of looking down at Egyptians as an inferior people and behaving in a very disrespectful way, probably something no more No better example of that would be when the French begin using Azhar Mosque as a stable for horses, and clearly a sign of disrespect. And at some point, it is also clear that many Egyptians would welcome the Ottoman Empire militarily trying to drive the French out. And in fact, the Ottoman begin to prepare such an invasion. And Bonaparte, anticipating that, decides to strike first, partly also because he still would appear to have this kind of ambition of recreating the equivalent of Alexander the Great's empire. And so in early 1799, Bonaparte invades Syria. At this time, Palestine, by the way, generally conceived as a part of Syria, sometimes referred to as southern Syria. And so Bonaparte invades, more correctly, we might say, Palestine in early 1799. And, Napoleon is a military genius. There's really little debate regarding that fact. And he wins several battles, but ultimately he's never able to consolidate his hold of Palestine or Syria. Probably the turning point is when he fails to take the city of Acre in the northern part of Palestine after laying siege to it for quite a while. And so some credit should go to the Ottoman governor of the city, often referred to as al-Jazar, the butcher, who, with the help of the Ottoman army and the British army, or more correctly, the British Navy, is able to prevent Napoleon from taking the city. Though one other factor is that the French soldiers are hit by the plague. So a combination of factors, also including poor supply lines and disease, are going to weaken the troops. Here we actually see kind of a makeshift hospital for some of the French soldiers who were struck down by the plague. I always find this a really interesting artistic rendering because in the center, surrounded by his men who have, come down with the plague, which is highly contagious, we find Napoleon. So it does tell you something also about Napoleon's character, that he saw himself as a man with a destiny and therefore is somewhat invincible. So quite willing to, just walk into a room full of plague-stricken men, even embracing them at some point, highly confident that he can never catch it. So Napoleon's attempt at creating a bigger empire at the expense of the Ottoman Empire basically fails. And then eventually Napoleon himself will abandon Egypt. In August of 1799, word gets to him that something is brewing in Paris. There's talk of a plot to overthrow the government that he should be a part of. And so literally in the middle of the night, Napoleon hops on a small boat and heads out from Egypt. Doesn't even tell his men. They wake up the next morning. It's like, whoa, Napoleon's gone. And off he goes to Paris, where he stages a coup, what's often referred to as the 18th of Brumaire, which is the date on the French revolutionary calendar when it happens, and eventually becoming the emperor of this new empire that he's going to try to create. The French army is left behind. Right, so it's not that the French have abandoned Egypt per se, but Napoleon is gone, and then from that point forward, the French are under continual harassment by British and Ottoman forces, and over time losing a large number of men, about 13,500 Frenchmen, many to disease, by the way, not actually dying in battle, but finally the French capitulate. And so they will be repatriated to Europe without their weapons on British ships. This happens in August of 1801, after which Egypt is no longer under foreign control. So before we talk about what happens next, I do want to mention one other very important aspect of the French occupation of Egypt, and that is the fact that Napoleon brought with him not just a massive army, but a huge team of French scholars to study pretty much every aspect of Egypt. You might be wondering, well, that seems a bit unusual, but to really understand why that happened, you need to kind of remember the connection between Napoleon, the French Revolution, and in some ways also to the Enlightenment. French Revolution supposedly reflecting Enlightenment ideals, and one of those ideals is, we could say, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And so he brings this team of scholars. You know, Napoleon often presented himself as a son of the Enlightenment or son of French revolutionary values. So he brings this team of scholars. And I mean, they literally study just about any and every aspect of Egyptian society, of the territory that you can imagine, right? Whether flora, fauna, geography, the, you know, then contemporary society, culture, Islam, and certainly most definitely, you know, anything related to the ancient Egyptian civilization. And I mean, they really collected an incredible wealth of information, which they eventually published in 9 huge volumes. This would have, by the way, huge impact in Europe. A lot of the interest that even until today people have regarding ancient Egypt stems from this enterprise, right? People would read, you know, what was in these 9 volumes, and they were greatly intrigued. Of course, we're kind of more interested in, you know, less in what impact this all had on Europe and more what impact this might have had on ancient Egyptians. You know, so imagine you have this huge team of scholars in Egypt. At some point, they set up a research institute in Cairo, where, by the way, they bring with them many of the latest kind of technological you know, machines and so forth, like most notably a printing press, things that many Egyptians have never seen before. And a lot of kind of the more learned Egyptians begin hanging out around this research institute. They're very much interested in learning about the latest, you know, kind of scientific, philosophical, ideological developments in Europe. You know, so there's kind of this idea that maybe this had a major impact in kind of stimulating a desire on the part of Egyptians and then later Middle Easterners to quote-unquote modernize. I mean, definitely at some point, there is this kind of idea that, you know, we need to modernize, and early on that's kind of associated with westernizing, right? To modernize means to become more like Europe. So, you know, this probably played some role. You know, the actual extent of it is perhaps debatable, and one of our readings by a fellow named Dijkstra is actually going to address the question of, you know, exactly how huge an impact this had in that regard. But, you know, probably did play some role. One last thing before we move on, you're probably wondering what that artifact is to the right. So that is something called the Rosetta Stone. And so some of you probably know there's a company called that. The company, by the way, takes the name from the artifact. And you probably know the purpose of the company is to teach languages. So, you know, when we talk about the real Rosetta Stone, which takes its name from a small village called Rosetta in the northern part of Egypt, it was found by a French soldier there. So what it is basically an artifact dating back to roughly the time of Cleopatra VII, right? Probably most of you have heard of that. This is the Hellenistic period in Egypt, maybe a little bit before the time of Christ. And so essentially what you have here is the same decree issued in 3 different scripts, right? So at the top in Greek letters, in the middle in Egyptian in Greek letters, and then finally at the bottom in Egyptian in ancient hieroglyphs. And by virtue of the fact that they all say the same thing, so you know what the hieroglyphs are saying collectively, you even have some sense of the order in which they're saying it. It's literally as if, you know, a team of scholars looked at this, it's literally as if they were able to break the code, you know, kind of like breaking a computer code. So eventually they were able to learn how to read hieroglyphs from this. And, you know, obviously with respect to what we know about ancient Egypt, this would have been a major breakthrough. Granted, this is all a bit of an aside. We're more interested in what happened in Egypt after the French left. And so the Ottoman Empire is going to try to reassert its authority in Egypt. And there's going to be kind of a period of chaos during which a number of different individuals are going to vie for control. In the end, to make a long story short, one individual, an Albanian soldier who had been part of the Ottoman expeditionary force sent there, will emerge as the new ruler. And his name is Muhammad Ali. Not to be confused with Cassius Clay. It's not an uncommon combination of names within Muslim societies. So here's the thing, right? In theory, he will represent Ottoman authority in Egypt. The title he takes is Ottoman Viceroy, literally governor, right? And so as Ottoman Viceroy, he will govern in Egypt from 1805 until his death in 1848, nominally recognizing the authority of the Ottoman Sultan, but in actual practice, he will govern Egypt as an almost entirely autonomous state with respect to the Ottoman Empire, right? So, and this is pretty important to realize in terms of understanding later developments. And Muhammad Ali, from an early point, really kind of buys into this idea of, we need to modernize Egypt, which means we need to borrow from Europe. We need to imitate to some degree Europe, though he has a very specific goal in mind. He wants to create a European-style army, right? I mean, certainly the French under Napoleon had made a pretty strong impression militarily. But in the process of doing that, and he's a pretty clever individual, he understands that you're going to have to make other kinds of changes as well. And a lot of it really about kind of developing Egypt as a whole. So a lot of construction, a lot of new infrastructure, to some extent, recognition of the need to educate Egyptians and so on. So just kind of one kind of more conventional kind of infrastructure or construction that will take place, the building of a new mosque. And, I thought we might just put this up there, the Muhammad Ali Mosque, which you can visit if you go to Cairo today. And that's actually located on the Citadel, an ancient fortress built by Saladin in the center of Cairo. In any event, right, for him, the main thing is to develop a European-style army, but he realizes that in order to do that, you're going to need money, and in order to raise the necessary revenue, you're going to have to make many kinds of reforms in terms of how you govern Egypt as a whole. So the main focus is on the military, but he realizes that reforms must be more extensive. And for him, it's pretty clear, right? To modernize Egypt means to imitate Europe, modernizing along European lines. So first of all, he's going to need help. He's going to bring in foreign instructors, to teach him about, certain kinds of developments that have been taking place in Europe, but also sending Egyptians abroad to study in Europe where they can gain the needed knowledge and bring it back. Now, Muhammad Ali recognizes that there are two main elements within Egyptian society that are probably going to resist the kind of changes he wants to make. And these are the ulama and the Mamluks. Well, the Mamluks are going to prove pretty easy to resolve. He's basically going to eliminate them in the most literal sense. In 1811, he has the Mamluks massacred. I know what you're thinking. Sounds like a rather drastic solution to the problem. We're going to find out what happens in the Ottoman Empire when sultans try to implement the same kinds of reforms. And there they will face opposition from the Janissaries. And they will try to handle it a bit differently. We'll kind of think about whether, maybe Muhammad Ali had a point when we look at what happens there. In any event, in the case of the Mamluks, it's kind of, a bit devious the way he does it. He basically invites them to a banquet within the citadel in honor of his son-in-law, Ibrahim Pasha, who had just been appointed to lead a kind of military operation. And so when they came in, kind of make sure that they kind of were all gathered in the central courtyard, had the gates closed, and had his men lined up on top of buildings and on top of the wall. And so as soon as they were kind of trapped in that central area, they basically just shot them from these high points until they were all dead. So, you have to say it was effective, if nothing else. Undermining the ulama, that's going to be a little bit more tricky, right? This is probably the most respected social group within Egyptian society. You can't just eliminate them in this fashion. So he's going to have to kind of undermine the source of their strength. A big part of this is going to be eliminating waqfs. So we haven't really talked about what waqfs are. Waqf is an Arabic term meaning religious endowment. So you had this tradition that had developed over the centuries whereby a certain property could be designated as a waqf, such that whatever revenue it produced would serve a designated purpose, perhaps to provide funding for an orphanage or for a hospital or for a mosque. But very often, different members of the ulama would be administratively responsible for these waqfs, and to some degree would benefit from whatever revenue, certainly from the prestige connected with it, that was produced by the waqf. And so this became kind of a source of power, finance, and influence among the ulama. Imagine also that important high-ranking members of the ulama who were in charge of waqfs could also appoint other individuals to lesser positions, right? So kind of a source of patronage. So what he does is he effectively nationalizes the lands previously designated as waqfs. He also confiscates a lot of privately owned land that until then had belonged to a kind of landed aristocracy, some of whom were in some fashion related to the Mamluks. You might remember that with the Mamluks, the children of Mamluks couldn't be Mamluks, so some of them had kind of filtered down into the larger Egyptian society. So all of this land is now going to be under state control, effectively giving the state, i.e. Muhammad Ali, a monopoly, and he's going to use that land in order to grow a single cash crop, cotton. So he's very familiar with the fact, the Industrial Revolution is just beginning to get underway in Europe, particularly in Britain. A lot of it is connected to textile manufacture, and there is a need for cotton. So he's going to grow cotton, sell it to British textile manufacturers, right, and then use that revenue in order to initiate other kinds of reforms and to build up a European-style military. Some of it will be used at home in new textile factories, but very little. And that kind of brings us to the fact that, even though he recognizes the importance of the Industrial Revolution to developments in Europe, which is pretty astute at this point because it's really only beginning to get underway, he doesn't really do much to initiate an industrial revolution in Egypt. He seems quite content for Egypt to play the role of providing raw materials for European factories, which is somewhat ironic. I mean, that ends up being a major aspect of European imperialism or colonialism. Here, Egypt, in a sense, fulfilling that role voluntarily. So there is some textile manufacture in Egypt. Mostly, though, it is tied to his desire to build up a European-style military, right? So cloth production for uniforms, a few factories that are producing munitions, but really not much in the way of industrial development. Mostly he's developing, as far as any kind of construction infrastructure, it's mostly geared towards improving agriculture. So new canals, roads, tools, fertilizers. And in fairness, we should note that he triples production, right? And production now almost entirely of this cash crop, cotton. There is some development in terms of new educational institutions, a teaching hospital, but very limited because, again, his primary goal is a European-style military. He does want to have greater state control of Egyptian territory, particularly in terms of controlling agriculture, realizes he needs to develop a bureaucracy, so you need some educated Egyptians, in order to work for the government in this regard. But everything is a means to this very specific end. There is also a teaching hospital, right? So, some very kind of basic developments educationally, but on a relatively small scale. European-style army. So, often even when there is some kind of industrial development, it's directly related to that. For instance, when he constructs a shipbuilding foundry in Alexandria, his military is going to be primarily army-based, but, needs maybe a small navy as, one component of it. Who's doing all this work? Basically, he is conscripting or drafting peasants. So first of all, to build up his army. European-style army at this point, by the way, means infantry-based. So he's going to conscript or draft large numbers of peasants, very often against their will, to make up this army. And by the way, back in those days, if you were conscripted, you're probably talking about, 10, 15, even 20 years. And very often under very brutal conditions, including if you're conscripted for labor gangs, right? So these are the people doing the work. And as you might imagine, they're being paid very poorly, almost hardly anything at all, and working under really horrific conditions. Many of them dying, but it does prove effective, right? I mean, very rapidly building up infrastructure, and kind of creating the kind of military he wants. So it's kind of ironic. I mean, Muhammad Ali does understand the role of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, right? So related to that, he understands that, you need educated individuals to kind of develop a modern style bureaucracy, people in government, people to actually help carry out these kind of reforms. I say ironic because, again, I mean, not doing much as far as industrializing Egypt itself, but he does understand, for instance, the value of education. Hence why he's bringing in foreign advisors and sending Egyptians to Europe to study. Now, as far as these young Egyptians who are being sent abroad, they're being given pretty clear instructions. They are expected to focus on technical subjects, right? Like, you're being over there to learn whatever engineering skills we need, or about agriculture, or about, kind of military reforms, and you should really stick to that. The problem is, in order to study abroad, you need to learn European languages. Early on, it's going to be primarily French, later on English and German. But once you learn these European languages, you now have access to other kinds of materials, and very quickly they become exposed to, for instance, liberal notions about representative government and nationalism. Right? Just different ways of organizing society, organizing the political system, and so forth. And even it's not just what they're reading, right? I mean, many of them end up spending years in places like Paris, later on Berlin, London. And so they're seeing, these European societies, they're seeing how people behave, just kind of different way of living, different way of engaging politics, and so forth. Certainly, in terms of certain developments in terms of technology. And many of them are really impressed by Europe's scientific advancement, and in particular by the patriotism of its citizens, right? As nationalism begins to spread in Europe, and perhaps earliest in France, they're really impressed by how people are passionate about their nation, willing to die for it, but also have a sense of obligation, a desire and willingness to participate in government, and so forth. And many of them start thinking, we need to introduce some of these ideas to people back home, to change the mentality of Egyptian people. And in this regard, probably one individual that really stands out is Rifa'ah Fafi al-Tahtawi, who is an Egyptian teacher and scholar who actually, probably the best way to put it is he goes to Paris as a chaperone. He's a religious teacher, but, kind of making sure that, these young Egyptian students don't run amok, right? So he ends up spending 5 years in Paris, beginning in 1826, in some ways, again, as a chaperone. But he's also learning a lot. And he, in particular, is very impressed by much of what he sees in Paris. He doesn't like everything, right? There's some things he feels, that, like we do better than Europeans, but he's pretty open-minded, and he's really starting to think about, what are some things, in terms of how they do things here. And he's thinking more in terms of like politics, how society's organized, educational systems, and so forth. What are some things they do better here that we really should consider adopting back home? And so when he gets back, he's really focused on, how to expose Egyptians to much of what he learned in Paris. At some point, he becomes the head of a state language school. So, one way might be to help, teach foreign languages to Egyptians. The more Egyptians that speak French and then later English and German, right, the more access they'll have to these kinds of ideas. And then later on, heading up a translation bureau beginning in 1841 in Cairo, because, wouldn't it make sense to start translating important works from European languages to Arabic, right? By the way, they speak, at this point, just to be clear, they speak Arabic. No one speaks Egyptian, which is a completely different language. I mean, except maybe Egyptian Christians sometimes using it as a liturgical language in the church, right? But he's like, if we translate European works into Arabic, then more people will know about it. And so you could say he plays a very central role early on in bringing Western science and methods to Egypt. And by the way, he wrote a very famous book about his experiences in Paris, things he liked, what he didn't like. We're going to kind of, maybe skim through a few pages of that. So, that's what we call a primary source, right? Written by someone directly connected with the kind of developments we're interested in, and it's by looking at those that historians are able to piece together what happened in the past. Well, in any event, Muhammad Ali did, in fact, create this European-style army, and it proved to be a very effective army. It was actually quite powerful. Again, remembering that nominally, in theory, Egypt's still part of the Ottoman Empire, and so the first time he deploys his new army will be on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, though we should be clear, he probably could have just said no if he really wanted. There's not much the Sultan could have done about it. But in any event, right, it very quickly demonstrates its effectiveness. It suppresses the Wahhabi movement in Arabia. It's this kind of Islamic fundamentalist movement that has started to develop there and then has started to consolidate its control over some territory. That is, in fact, the same Wahhabi movement that will later help establish the House of Ibn Saud in Arabia. But this time around, the Egyptian army on behalf of the Sultan is able to suppress the movement. Later, it will fight alongside the Ottoman Empire against the Greeks when they assert their independence from the Ottoman Empire. But, if it weren't clear that, Egypt effectively independent of the Ottoman Empire, the next time he uses the army will be against the Ottoman Empire, when Egypt occupies Syria, inclusive of Palestine, between 1832 and 1839. And this will happen under Ibrahim Pasha, who is the Egyptian general responsible for that expeditionary force and also the adopted son of Muhammad Ali. In fact, we mentioned him briefly when talking about the massacre of the Mamluks. I think I mistakenly said son-in-law, should have been adopted son. But in any event, he will head up the expeditionary force that occupies Syria and Palestine, and then for about 10 years govern those territories on behalf of Muhammad Ali. And eventually this army will even threaten the very existence of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, some historians feel that if it wasn't for the intervention of the European powers, particularly Britain at that point, on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, that might have marked the end of that empire. The Egyptians in the end are actually, basically the European powers say, no, you're not going to do this, and if you do, you're going to have big problems. And eventually even compel the Egyptians to relinquish their control of Syria and Palestine, which at that point falls back under Ottoman control. We'll get to this a bit later, but for much of the 19th century, the British had adopted a policy of maintaining the Ottoman Empire. It was generally considered, to some degree supported by the French, but it was generally considered that if the Ottoman Empire were to fall, then the Russian Empire would probably swoop in and take control of most of what up until then was Ottoman territory, and that this would greatly upset the balance of power, right? So it's kind of considered imperative that the integrity of the Ottoman Empire be maintained. In any event, coming back to developments in Egypt, after Muhammad Ali's death, Ibrahim Pasha briefly serving as ruler. So, I mean, for a very short period of time, and he died in 1848 and served as regent. They still maintained, by the way, this kind of fiction of being part of the Ottoman Empire, so still took the title of viceroy. After Ibrahim Pasha, Muhammad Ali's grandson Abbas was the ruler, was the viceroy. He actually was kind of opposed to continuing, the kind of reforms that Muhammad Ali had initiated. So you have kind of this brief period where things stagnate. But he eventually is murdered in 1854, and things pick up after that. And probably most important in this regard is going to be Isma'il, who governs from 1863 until 1879, when the British force him to step down. So under Isma'il, modernization is really going to pick up. He basically supports what Muhammad Ali had been doing, but he tries to really kind of ramp up this whole process. The problem is it's going to cost a lot of money, and to Muhammad Ali's credit, he did it on his own dime. He never borrowed so much as a cent in order to, implement the kind of reforms he did. Under Isma'il, it's going to be very different. He ends up borrowing a lot of money and puts the country heavily in debt. But he's very ambitious. He actually once stated, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe." So maybe more correct to say no longer in the Middle East, but basically, really also promoting the idea that Egyptian identity was somehow more tied to the ancient Egyptian civilization, the pre-Islamic period. This certainly did not reflect the mindset of most Egyptians, but it does tell you something about his ambition. He really wanted to transform Egypt into a European state. And he does achieve quite a bit. He greatly modernizes Egypt. We see new law codes introduced, the construction of a fair number of educational institutions, a lot of kind of development in terms of infrastructure. Alexandria and Cairo in particular, highly modernized. If you were to visit them in, say, the early 1870s, they would have seemed more European than, say, New York. On the other hand, he was not really interested in reforms of a political nature. So he's very autocratic. In other words, he liked to govern as a dictator. And so he ended up having a lot of enemies, right? So on the one hand, resisted by the ulama, many of whom were very conservative. They didn't like, for instance, new law codes, kind of development of more secular educational curriculums and so forth. But then you had also many individuals who wanted political reform, right? Who argued for individual freedom, greater local autonomy, who were actually calling for representative government and so forth. And he wasn't interested in that. He didn't want to do anything that would mean relinquishing power. But, if you're talking about kind of, infrastructure, you're talking about the development of certain kinds of institutions, probably the most important infrastructural construction will be the building of the Suez Canal, which opens in 1869, but proves immensely expensive. Indeed, even the celebration of the opening cost 2 million Egyptian pounds, which for that period was quite a lot. So, he was something of a spendthrift, right? Even spending money when it wasn't entirely necessary. By the way, just kind of fun fact, part of the whole kind of opening ceremony was the construction of a new opera house, the Khedivial Opera House, which was dedicated in 1869. Unfortunately, you can't visit it today because it burned down in 1971. Constructed for the sole purpose of providing a venue for the performance of an opera that had been written for the occasion of the opening of the Suez Canal by Giuseppe Verdi, one of the great composers of opera, and it is in fact one of the most famous operas he ever composed, Aida. It actually didn't end up being performed here, but it was actually composed for this occasion. The problem is, again, spending a lot of money. Now, for a while during the 1860s, it didn't seem such a bad idea. There was a cotton boom, and on the basis of that, banks and other lenders were willing to lend money at low interest rates. Good question to ask is, why was there a cotton boom? Because there was a civil war in America. A major source of cotton that was thus cut off, meaning the price of cotton went up, and Egypt, to some degree, able to corner the market. So the problem is, eventually the boom came to an end because the American Civil War came to an end. And so, at some point, the interest rates went up and revenue from cotton went down. And so Egypt, falling heavily into debt, Isma'il raised taxes at some point, but eventually, you just can't squeeze blood from a stone. You couldn't tax Egyptians any further. eventually selling Egypt's share in the Suez Canal Company to the British, 44% of stock, meaning that they no longer really had majority ownership of the canal or even any kind of ownership. And in spite of all this, continuing to spend money, particularly getting Egypt involved in wars that it very easily could have avoided. For instance, fighting alongside the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish War or invading Ethiopia. So the debt just really spiraling out of control at some point. I should note that the kind of interest rates that are being, that Egypt is being, that's being imposed on Egypt are extraordinary, right? I mean, we're talking about like 150% or something, of the likes you just wouldn't see today. And at some point, most of this money owed to the British and French, who are increasingly concerned about Egypt's ability to service its debt. And so in 1878, they impose some measure of financial control on Egypt, what's known as the dual financial control. Isma'il is forced to accept what they call a constitutional ministry made up of foreign officers. A British official will serve as Minister of Finance, right, thus controlling money coming in, and a French minister will serve as Minister of Public Works, thus controlling Egyptian expenditures. Well, the long and short of it is, can you call a country in any fashion independent if foreign powers have complete control of their finances? I mean, imagine if somewhere down the road, the U.S. debt to China was so huge that China imposed Chinese officials, put them in charge of the U.S. Treasury. Now, of course, I mean, that would probably be impossible because of, kind of the U.S. military strength. U.S. would resist. Egypt doesn't have that possibility. I mean, they're, quite inferior militarily to the British and French. And so they have to accept it. But at some point it gets worse. The British and French decide they can't trust Isma'il, that maybe he's not being cooperative enough, and they force him to step down in favor of his son Tawfiq in 1879, someone they feel that they can actually better control. We'll pick up the story of developments in Egypt later, but I want now to look at what was going on during this period, first in the Ottoman Empire, and then briefly at what was happening in Iran. So starting with the Ottoman Empire, first to note that, by the beginning of the 19th century, it does appear that the Ottoman Empire is clearly in a state of decline. I should point out, a lot of historians debate, exactly what do we mean by decline? Would we talk about this period as one of decline, if we know how the story ends because of World War I, the Ottoman Empire basically comes to an end. What if World War I had never happened? Maybe the Ottoman Empire carries on. So some people like to use the term decentralization, where the central government has less direct control of its territory. Having said that, for most people at the time, both in and out of the Ottoman Empire, certainly the perception was that the Ottoman Empire was in a state of decline. Europeans saw it this way. At some point, the Russian Tsar coined the nickname for the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, and sadly it stuck. There were many officials, high-ranking officials in the Ottoman Empire, who really felt that things were in a state of crisis, something had to be done. And so kind of like what happened in Egypt, there's kind of this growing sensibility that the Ottoman Empire needs to modernize, quote unquote, modernize along European lines. We can at least say that militarily the Ottoman Empire is in a state of decline. They're losing territory at a rapid pace. So whereas during much of their early history they kept expanding, now every time there's a major battle, increasingly with Russia, they're losing territory, as illustrated on this map, kind of color-coded, chronologically when they lost different territories. So much as with Muhammad Ali in Egypt, early attempts at reform are going to focus on the military. And so kind of the first kind of real attempt at reform, though somewhat modest, will be under Sultan Ahmed III, who was Sultan from 1703 to 1730. So this is actually quite a ways before the French occupation of Egypt. But, already Ottoman Empire losing a lot of battles, so there's kind of a growing concern about that. And so during the period between 1718 and 1730, which was kind of a rare respite from having to be at war, and the Ottoman Empire had just lost actually another war, concluded with the Treaty of Passarowitz, but they had a break, so like we should take advantage. And so during this period, sometimes referred to as the Tulip Era, because Sultan Ahmed III loved tulips. By the way, there's a big debate between the Dutch and Turks about where the tulip came from. I'm not going to get into that. But in any event, right, reforms primarily aimed at the military, the defenses of the empire, and for the most part, pretty modest, not really kind of challenging the status quo in any meaningful way. The first major attempt at reform, and again focusing primarily on the military and kind of military capability, would be under Sultan Selim III, who is Sultan from 1789 to 1807. And now we're coming into the kind of post-French occupation of Egypt period. And so this is going to be a much more serious attempt at basically kind of, entirely revamping the military, and the reforms that Sultan Selim III proposes are going to be greatly resisted by both the ulama and the janissaries. The ulama primarily out of a kind of a more conservative outlook, resistant to radical change. With the janissaries, there's some of that, but it's really kind of more about preserving their kind of elite status within the military. To modernize a military along European lines basically means to, make it much more about the infantry and kind of more about conscription, i.e. the draft, and, just kind of also about kind of certain military technologies. All of this that would greatly undermine the position of the janissaries. And they eventually actually rise up in revolt and are able to force Selim to step down. And in fact, eventually he's imprisoned. And you might remember I mentioned that perhaps after finding out what happened in the Ottoman case with the janissaries, we might be a bit more sympathetic to how Muhammad Ali dealt with the Mamluks, kind of the equivalent in certain respects, right? So that he had dealt very harshly with them and in fact had them assassinated. So maybe that we now recognize that he might have had good reason for doing that. So it really isn't until the next two sultans that we have kind of a serious drive at reform, a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat, which is a Turkish term borrowed from Arabic meaning to reorganize. So it really is going to be this kind of idea of, revamping every aspect of Ottoman government, of the Ottoman economy, of the Ottoman educational system, and certainly the Ottoman military. And this will correspond to the rule of two sultans, starting with Mahmud II. And in fact, the Tanzimat reforms begin pretty much at the end of his reign in 1839, and then carrying on under the rule of Abdülmecid. Abdülmecid will rule until 1861. The Tanzimat reforms pretty much coming to an end in 1878, so carrying on a little bit beyond him. And I should note, right, while being supportive of these reforms, and it is during the rule of Mahmud II that the janissaries are finally brought to heel, by the way. In this case, he disbands them, but large numbers end up being massacred. So kind of gets them out of the way. So they are supportive, but they ultimately will not be the driving force behind the Tanzimat reforms. Probably much more important in that regard will be a series of prime ministers, or the term actually used in the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman government would have been grand viziers. And so four individuals in particular are going to stand out during the reign of Abdülmecid, and that will be Ali Pasha, Fuad Pasha, Ahmed Şevdet Pasha, and Midhat Pasha. Pasha actually just being a kind of honorific indicative of their high rank. Sometimes the term pasha also referring to governors, for instance. So these four individuals are actually going to be the driving force behind the Tanzimat reform, their formulation, the specific reforms that are actually going to be implemented and so forth. And if we're talking about the Tanzimat, I mean, really, we're talking about a huge number of reforms with respect to many different aspects of Ottoman government, the economy, and so forth. But there are a number of decrees that are issued that kind of embody the underlying principles and are worth noting. And so the three that really stand out in this regard, the Hati Sharif of Gulhain, the Hati Humayun, and the nationality law. And there are a number of key principles that are really kind of enunciated in all three. Probably the most important is that of religious equality, right? The idea that all Ottoman subjects are of equal status regardless of religion. And up until now, while non-Muslims had definitely had a pretty, just environment, in terms of having a certain degree of autonomy in connection with the millet system. You can't really speak of them as being somehow oppressed, but in many respects they were perceived as kind of having a secondary status. Being Muslim also meant being kind of part of the mainstream of Ottoman society, and in certain respects enjoying a higher status politically, socially, economically. We should be careful. There are many other ways of defining status, economic. The fact that certain families were particularly important. If you were a Christian coming from a very wealthy, important Christian family, perhaps being very active economically, in many respects your status would have been higher than, say, a poor Muslim peasant. But by and large, there was kind of the idea that by virtue of being Muslim, you did enjoy higher status. That is now going to change, at least in principle, right? And it is going to take some time for people, for the subjects of the Ottoman Empire to kind of accept that. Both Muslims and Christians, many of them are going to find this problematic, and we'll discuss this a bit as we move forward. But also related to this is what we might say a kind of redefining of Ottoman subjects as Ottoman citizens, right? So this is defining someone as a citizen as opposed to a subject in many ways speaks to a reconception of the relationship between government and the people who are governed, right? So subjects basically kind of speaks to the authority of the government, in this case the Sultan, and the primary responsibility of Ottoman subjects is to obey that authority. With citizenship, you're kind of speaking more about a relationship wherein government has a certain obligation towards the people to kind of represent them. And also, kind of the idea that as citizens, individuals have certain rights, but by the way, also certain obligations, right? So that is going to be a major aspect of the Tanzimat reforms, right? They're not just about infrastructural changes or kind of, the creation of new institutions, but also trying to kind of redefine the relationship between Ottoman authority and the subject population. Especially important with regard to this idea of a transformation from Ottoman subjects to Ottoman citizens will be the promotion of an ideology known as Ottomanism. So, a lot of the Tanzimat reforms are about really, kind of concrete kinds of changes related to infrastructure, education, the building of schools, creation of a secular curriculum, definitely military reforms, involving, kind of the structure of the military, military technology, and so forth. Ottomanism kind of, more ideological kind of element here, right? And it really does tie into this principle of religious equality. Religious categories very often corresponding to different ethnic and linguistic groups. So, kind of the idea, like, we really need to promote the idea that we are all part of one Ottoman nation, regardless of religion, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of our primary language, related to which we are all equal citizens of the Ottoman state. And very relevant here is the growing pervasiveness of nationalism in general, but in most cases, being defined in connection with specific ethnic linguistic groups, right? So you have kind of an emerging Greek nationalist movement, Bulgarian nationalist movement, later the promotion of kind of more individualistic Turkish and Arab national identities, and all of this very divisive to the empire, right? So one major motivation behind the promotion of Ottomanism, trying to kind of counter this development. Like, yes, fine, think nationalistically, but why not define a national identity that includes everyone? And this might also, help to foster a sense of commitment to the empire, and also a sense that whatever grievance you have, you might, try to address within the framework of a shared Ottoman identity, right? So also kind of tying into, certain aspects of social unrest tied to, the promotion of equality, something that, both Muslims and non-Muslims in the empire are finding it difficult to wrap their minds around. So, definitely non-Muslims enjoying, the new rights that they have. For instance, the abolishing of certain taxes required of non-Muslims. But, then there's a question of responsibility to the state. Part of being a citizen isn't, just what the government does for you. It's also what you do for the state and for the government. Probably the most important shared responsibility, right? So we already talked about this a bit, but probably the most important shared responsibility is military service. Something not required of non-Muslims up until, roughly the middle of the 19th century. But now which they are expected to do. And I should point out, if you were drafted or conscripted into the army, we're not talking about for 2 or 3 years. We're talking something more in the neighborhood of 20 years. So, a big question is going to be, are non-Muslims prepared to do that? And in fact, many will continue to find ways to somehow avoid doing military service. That, by the way, becomes a source of great resentment to many Muslims, right? But again, this ties into kind of Ottomanism, right? The idea of, creating a sense of being part of a shared nation, developing a sense of patriotism and so forth, and shared commitment inclusive of military service. So I left out one category of reform, might call it administrative reform. So during this period, there's a growing sensibility among reformers, often referred to as the young Ottomans. Many of them are very youthful and very much open to radical change. That we need, kind of more representative government. So we're going to see the creation of representative bodies at various levels of administration, at local level, provincial, right up to the top. So, many of them had been educated in Western universities and really came to believe that the best solution to the empire's growing social unrest was the creation of some kind of constitutional monarchy, or we might say constitutional sultanate. Right, so this would provide a kind of form wherein the various issues confronting the empire, many of which were divisive, social unrest related to Ottoman quote-unquote citizens now adapting to the idea of religious equality, the various nationalist movements that were taking shape, many of which were agitating to break away from the empire to form their own independent states, and by this point had actually had managed that. The Greeks had already broken away, Serbians, Romanians, and so forth. Eventually the Bulgarians would break away. So, they really felt that the creation of some kind of, representative government, some kind of national representative body that the Sultan would have to govern alongside of, essentially a parliament, would be the best solution, right? To, kind of create a basis for being more committed to the empire and so forth. All of this is going to culminate with the creation of an Ottoman constitution and an Ottoman parliament, both in 1876. And they have elections, which actually go off without, a hitch. I mean, they are legitimate elections. And it should be noted that the various different peoples are, in one degree or another, represented within this new national representative body. When they actually come into session, most of those present do seem committed to the I mean, they are promoting the interests of, whatever part of the empire they came from, but they also seem quite cognizant of what is in the interests of the Ottoman Empire as a whole, what we might call its national interests. So they do seem committed to the, maintaining the integrity of the empire. So it does look kind of promising. So I want to be careful, about saying, well, ultimately Ottomanism failed because these other nationalist ideologies are going to prevail. And that is true. But you kind of wonder if perhaps this new representative government had been given a real chance, maybe it would have turned out better. What actually happened is, well, that same year, 1876, we also have a new Sultan, Abdülmecid II. And within 2 years, he dissolves both the constitution and the parliament in 1878. Some of that reflected that he really never kind of bought into this whole idea of a constitutional sultanate. Certainly he didn't like the idea that it would infringe upon his own authority. And then, as it turned out, the Ottoman Empire at some point found itself on the brink of war with Russia. And from his perspective, and there was, a little kind of kernel of truth to this, from his perspective, it seemed that this kind of parliamentary system of government, really was very ineffective. I mean, that mostly it resulted in a lot of bickering and a lot of indecisiveness, and he decided finally that, it had to go. And from that point forward, he will rule autocratically. But many in the Ottoman Empire had a taste of, shall we say, democracy or representative government. And so, we're gonna kind of leave the Ottoman Empire at this point. We'll pick up the story again later. But there are many individuals within the Ottoman Empire, and many of them belonging to different ethnic linguistic groups, who had actually to some degree bought into Ottomanism, and had high hopes about this kind of new parliamentary system of government, and were very disappointed to see it brought to an end. And so I'll leave it at that. And we're going to wrap up this particular lecture by looking very briefly at developments in Iran. So we kind of left things in Iran with the Qajar tribe. And so, at some point the Safavid Empire had come to an end, and things became a bit chaotic very briefly. So there were kind of a number of different rulers that emerged, attempts at establishing different dynasties, until eventually the leader of the Qajar tribe was able to reunite Iran and establish the Qajar dynasty that will carry on for a bit of time. One thing that happens almost immediately, they establish a new capital at a village near the ruins of the ancient city of Rey, now known as Shahr-e-Rey, named Tehran. And of course, that is the present-day capital of Iran. The guy who actually established this new dynasty, Aga Mohammed Khan, was actually crowned only 1 year before his death. But the dynasty carried on. And so we have a new dynasty, the Qajar dynasty, and they're going to be running into the same kind of problems and concerns that both Egypt and the Ottoman Empire are experiencing during the 19th century. The primary one being a growing concern about European influence, initially kind of more economically and to some degree culturally, but then eventually more politically, even the fear that at some point they might be subjected to European rule. In the case of the Qajar dynasty, the primary problem is that they are sandwiched between two expanding empires. To the north, the Russian Empire is very rapidly conquering territory at the expense of Iran, particularly in Central Asia. Right, and there is at some point even the fear that Russia might take over Iran itself. And then to the south, the British are creating a vast empire in India and very rapidly pushing north. And so, in fact, at some point, really the main thing preventing Iran from falling to either Russia or the British is that neither the Russians or the British are prepared to allow that to happen, right? The British are not prepared to see Iran become part of the Russian Empire, and the Russians are not prepared to see Iran fall within the orbit of British influence. So Iran will never actually be conquered, even if at some point, and again, this kind of really reflects the dynamic between Russia and the British, even if at some point Iran will be divided into 3 different zones reflective of Russian and British influence, right? Where you end up with a kind of Russian zone in the north, a British zone in the south, and a supposed neutral zone that is fully independent in the center, but of course, only able to maintain even a semblance of independence by playing the British and Russians off one another. But clearly there is a recognition that Iran desperately needs reform, especially of the military, but much as we've seen in the Ottoman and Egyptian cases, kind of a recognition that this would also require other kinds of reforms related to government, society as a whole, and so forth. So probably the main period of reform in the case of Iran, or at least where any kind of serious reform is attempted, will be under the rule of Nasr ad-Din Shah, who rules Persia from 1848 to 1896. So that's a rather significant block of time. And so during his reign, Western science, technology, and also educational methods will be introduced into Iran. And again, mostly he is able to maintain Iran's independence, or at least some degree of independence, by exploiting the distrust between Great Britain and Russia, right? Neither of which is prepared to see the other become completely dominant in the country. Related to this, we might mention one interesting development. So you have this kind of rivalry centered around Iran between the Russian Empire and the British, and at some point the British create a kind of buffer state to prevent further Russian expansion at the expense of their empire in India. So this buffer state is Afghanistan, created out of a number of smaller territories inhabited by, a number of different peoples who really didn't see themselves as having any kind of shared identity. So I just kind of mentioned this, we decided at the beginning that we're not going to include Afghanistan as part of the Middle East. So we're not really going to look at the present day conflict there. But some would argue that this might be one factor. That, the fact that it was kind of created artificially out of a number of different peoples, and so you never really saw the development of a kind of shared identity that would allow for some measure of cohesion nationalistically. And finally, we should note that during this period, much of Central Asia would end up becoming part of the Russian Empire. These are territories that historically had for a long period of time fallen within the sphere of influence of the Persian Empire or Iran, and now, really becoming much more connected to Russia. And this newly established relationship would, in fact, carry on up until and through the Soviet period, during which time these territories would be reconfigured as, in theory, independent Soviet socialist republics that had voluntarily become part of this confederacy of states, but, actually were under the direct authority of Moscow. So this is a pretty good place to stop. We're going to, when we come back, we're going to pick up the story in Egypt where we left off with the dual financial control. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll see you then.